If you looked like this in 2005, then you may be entitled to financial compensation. What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock MBA, and today we are going to talk about emo. Because if you are watching this, there's a very good chance that you were emo, meaning that you looked like this and listened to bands that sounded like this. But either way, the fact of the matter is that by the mid-2000s, bands like Fall Out Boy, My Chemical Romance, Paramore, Panic! At the Disco, and My Chemical Romance were selling millions of albums, headlining MTV awards shows, and even suburban soccer moms knew what emo meant. Brayden, Jaden, Caden, do not get emo with me or I'm taking away your GameCube. It had gone from something that a few people in Washington, D.C. created to expand the creative and cultural boundaries of hardcore and punk, to something that was literally on the cover of teen magazines that you would see on the table at the waiting room at the dentist's office. But that was well over a decade ago. And emo has been dead for years, right? Yes, but actually no. So what happened? What killed emo? And did it really rise from the grave? Like a zombie Gerard way? That is the question that I will try to answer in this video. But first, if you haven't, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of my videos. And also, I want to thank Raid Shadow Legends for sponsoring this video. Raid Shadow Legends has taken over and brings a console level experience to your phone. And it's a tough game. It's got 10 challenging dungeons. And if you care about story, it's got an awesome, fully voiced campaign, and there are 13 unique factions. Raid also has an incredible 460 champions, and it's super active with over 200,000 clans fighting and competing right now. You combine all those things and you get a game with basically endless content and infinite ways to play. What I like about the game is how much you can customize everything. There's hundreds of champions, and each one has several slots for gear, and Raid recently released its biggest update ever, the Doom Tower. It's a giant tower with over 120 floors, a bunch of secret challenge rooms, and 12 seriously badass bosses to take on. And this month is absolutely stacked with special events too. So if you want to check it out, just go to the video description, click on the special links, and if you're a new player, you will get 50,000 silver, 50 gems, 1 energy refill, 1 clan boss key, 5 mystery shards, 1 day XP booster, and 1 free champion called Executioner. And all this treasure will be waiting for you right here. So good luck, and I'll see you there. And with that out of the way, let's get into it.
Emo is found in books, magazines, even the hit movie Spider-Man 3. Well, parents, there are some dangerous elements to this culture.
In order to understand what killed the mall emo scene of the mid-2000s, first I think we need to back up and understand how we got there. So let me start with my personal introduction to emo, which was in about 1993, I think. I was very into straight edge bands like Youth of Today and Gorilla Biscuits and Minor Threat, and I kept hearing people say, oh, well, if you're into stuff like that, you should check out this band called Dag Nasty, which I did. I got their second album, Wig Out at Denko's. And I loved it. It was clearly rooted in hardcore, but it was a little bit more melodic and poppy, kind of like what 7 Seconds was doing, who I also loved, and with lyrics that were definitely more thoughtful and introspective than what you would get from your typical hardcore band. And I found out that they were part of a genre called emocore, which was emotional hardcore. I didn't know what that meant, and honestly kind of still don't, because isn't all music emotional, especially hardcore? In any case, I found out that this stuff started in Washington, D.C. in like 85, 86, with bands like Rites of Spring, Embrace, and Fugazi doing something along the lines of like thinking man's hardcore.
I woke up this morning with a piece of glass caught in my throat.
So I checked that stuff out, and honestly, I really didn't like any of it. Rites of Spring were cool, but a little bit too noisy for me. But still, I understood what they were going for, and I appreciated their kind of overall approach. Because as much as I'll always love classic hardcore bands like the Circle Jerks or DI or the Meatmen or DRI or whatever, there isn't really a lot of emotional depth there. And especially back then, the prevailing sentiment was kind of like, feelings aren't punk. Here's how Norm from Texas Is the Reason put it. I think this is really good. In New York City, being called emo was akin to being called soft, but the derision with which the word was used suggested that emo had also become an updated shorthand for. So although I didn't really care for what any of those first generation emo bands were doing musically, I appreciated where they were coming from, and I did like quite a bit of stuff in the next generation of bands.
Emo's on MySpace. Why can't you get your own shit? I mean, they need to like emo space or something. They can all cry to each other.
Which brings us to part 2, what I'm calling the real emo years, from roughly 1992 to 2002. The important thing to understand here is that although none of this music really sounded like hardcore exactly, it was definitely still an extension of or a subset of the hardcore scene. And I'll come back to this later because I think it's actually super important. And to me, there are 3 main flavors of emo during this era, which I will talk about in order of least to most popular. First of all, the screamo flavor, which sounds like this. And I know that these days people like to talk about bands like Orchid and Page 99 and Seisha as real screamo, and I have nothing but respect for them, great bands, but they were the second generation of this stuff. The first wave was bands on labels like Ebullition and especially Gravity Records. Bands like Heroin, Antioch Arrow, and Portraits of Past, which basically took what Embrace and Rites of Spring were doing, but just cranked the intensity way, way up. This shit was very, very intense and definitely deserves the label of emotional hardcore. And the second big flavor is what I would call like the Midwest emo or Twinkle Daddy flavor. Bands like Braid, Captain Jazz, Rainier Maria, Christie Front Drive, Sunny Day Real Estate. And I personally never liked any of this stuff because it gets a little bit too close to indie rock for me, and I don't like any kind of indie music. But again, I can respect it. It's definitely good music. If I personally had to pick one band out of this genre, it would be The Promise Ring.
Well, it's getting dark, and I'll be in there after dark.
That stuff still holds up. Davey is probably the single best songwriter out of this whole era of emo. I also have to give credit to these bands and their labels, especially Jade Tree, for really raising the bar in terms of aesthetics and creative direction. This is right around when I was getting into graphic design, and although I didn't love these bands musically, their album art was very, very influential to me. It won awards in like mainstream graphic design magazines, and I think it probably got a lot of other kids into design too. And lastly, what I will call the rock flavor. Bands like Far Side, Game Face, Sensefield, Texas Is the Reason, and although they were from the Midwest, I would include the Get Up Kids here as well stylistically. And I actually really like a lot of this stuff, especially Game Face. And Get Up Kids. But personally, there are 2 albums that really define this era for me, and I think changed emo as a whole. First of all, the Revelation Records In-Flight Program sampler from 1997, which had bands like Texas Is the Reason, Shades Apart, and Into Another. Revelation Records was the definitive 80s hardcore label, and by putting this comp out and promoting it as heavily as they did, they were pretty much telling everybody hardcore's out and emo is in. And second, Saves the Day's first album, Through Being Cool, in 1999. Which I remember just completely taking over the scene when it came out, kind of like how Asking Alexandria and Of Mice and Men did 10 years later. And in hindsight, it's easy to see why, because this album is fucking great. Easily one of the best albums to ever come out of the hardcore scene. All the other guys in the band were kind of cute in that nerdy sort of Michael Cera way that we think of as emo now. And it had great production. Shout out to the legend Steve Evans. Personally, if I had to pick one album that would become the template for everything that we would think of as emo, it would be this. It would be Through Being Cool. There's a very, very clear through line from Saves the Day to bands like Taking Back Sunday and My Chemical Romance, since they're from just like a couple towns over. And if you listen to early Fall Out Boy, it's actually very, very similar to this album. But before I go on, I want to talk about 2 big changes that I saw in the scene at that time, which are just as important as the music in terms of the larger trajectory of emo. First of all, the more polished aesthetic that I mentioned in terms of like graphics and packaging. The stuff that Jade Tree was putting out looked as good or better as any major label release, which I think was a big part of what helped that break out of the scene. It didn't look like your typical like grimy photocopied hardcore 7-inch. And second, these bands brought a massive amount of women into the scene. At a hardcore show in like 1993, there would be like maybe 2 or 3 girls there out of 100 people. But if you went to go see Saves the Day, Promise Ring, or Texas Is the Reason a few years later, I'd say at least half, if not more, of the audience was women. And that was cool for a lot of reasons. Number one being that it was just kind of a nice break from that like super masculine, aggressive energy of hardcore. And you know, me as an awkward 19 or 20-year-old guy, I certainly wasn't unhappy about being surrounded by cute emo girls at those shows, even if I was too scared to talk to most of them. But more importantly than that, bringing women in vastly expanded the potential audience for this kind of music beyond just the hardcore scene and hardcore dudes. And that is very important because as much as this seems to annoy the rock and metal elitists, when it comes to music and pop culture, by far the most powerful group of people on the planet, the ones who are truly in charge and call the shots, it's teenage girls. They are the ones who decide what's popular, not the critics, not the salty dudes with beards, and not old ass YouTubers like me. So I would argue that maybe the most important thing that happened was that influx of women into the scene. Which is exactly what set up the next big inflection point, the rise of the Vagrant Records kind of scene. Get Up Kids, Alkaline Trio, and to me, most significantly, Dashboard Confessional, who came up in more or less like the South Florida hardcore scene, and kind of out of nowhere, ended up having a radio hit, winning MTV awards, and telling the world that emo had outgrown the hardcore scene.
Emos are horrible! They're posers!
Which brings us to part 3, the mall screamo years from roughly 2002 to 2008. This is what most people think of when you say emo, the glory years of what I affectionately call the mall screamo scene, because that's what it was. This is what happened when you took the stuff happening at like DIY basement shows in the hardcore scene in the 90s, and then refined it and polished it enough to where it was accessible enough to be on MTV or on Hot Topic. One big moment for me was when Dashboard Confessional had a song on the Spider-Man soundtrack, or when they did the 2004 Honda Civic tour with Get Up Kids and Thrice. And it was like, wow, a couple years ago, these bands were sleeping on my friends' floors, and now here they are getting sponsored by Honda and having songs in Kirsten Dunst movies. But the peak of this to me was Pete Wentz being on the cover of J14, the ultimate sign that emo had hit the big time. Pete from Race Trader and Birthright was on the cover of a teen magazine. What a time to be alive. I am actually not going to dwell on this part of the video too much because I think it's already been very well documented, and I've talked about it a lot anyway. But this is when Fall Out Boy, My Chemical Romance, Taking Back Sunday, The Used, Panic at the Disco, Paramore, Fall Out Boy were legitimately huge mainstream bands. Some of the biggest bands in the world, as big as, say, Billie Eilish is now. Massive. And let's talk about why they got so big. Because although I didn't really think about it this way at the time, in hindsight, it's super clear to me why mall emo became such a big thing. Because the breakout bands, the ones that got truly huge, had all the raw materials for that kind of success.
These are emo scene kids, but if you're over 25, you've probably never heard of them.
First of all, stars. I've talked about this before, like in my video about Hayley Williams. People don't like to hear it, but it's just the truth. Yes, obviously the music is important, but the truth is that a genre's success depends just as much, if not more, on having big charismatic personalities that can be the faces of the genre, that can capture the media's attention. And you had that in Hayley Williams, Gerard Way, Brendan Urie, Pete Wentz, and to a lesser extent, people like Burt McCracken. And the fact that all of them are still huge stars says a lot. I mean, I would argue that Brendan Urie is now more famous than he was then, as compared to, say, the bands of the previous generation, like the Get Up Kids and Saves the Day, who had some great songs, but no disrespect to those bands, they just don't have the big stars like a Hayley or a Gerard Way. But that said, the other thing is that they definitely did have the songs. Truly great, timeless songs that transcend genres or trends. Songs like Black Parade or I Write Sins, Not Tragedies are certified classics. Like my 40-year-old sister from Vietnam knows the choruses to those songs. That is how iconic they are. And lastly, they also had the resources of major labels behind them to push them at a time when that was very, very important. Because remember, this is before social media and streaming were nearly as big as they are now. So radio, MTV, and magazines were the way that you broke a band. And the majors had the money and connections to make that happen in a way that the older labels like, say, Eulogy, Doghouse, or Revelation just didn't. But like anything else that gets this big, it couldn't last forever. And by the 2010s, the emo boom was officially over. Fall Out Boy went on hiatus in 2010. My Chemical Romance kind of slowed down and then broke up in 2013. Paramore was still going strong, but they did change styles. And the fans had mostly moved on to genres like EDM or hardcore or indie rock that were a little bit more age appropriate for people in their 20s. So what happened? What killed emo? Why did the bubble pop so suddenly?
Emo started spreading on the internet, it just exploded.
The way I think of it, some genres just kind of can't be your forever home. You can love it and be super passionate about it when you're a kid, but you kind of can't stay there forever. And I think that was the case for emo, as well as ska and nu metal, as compared to genres like, say, thrash metal, which you can kind of continue to be the thrash guy into your 40s or 50s if you want. You can love Sugar We're Going Down for your whole life, but you just can't be the angsty Fall Out Boy super fan with the swoopy hair and those fingerless stripy gloves when you're like 25, right? I mean, I suppose you could, but generally speaking, people don't. And so I think it was kind of inevitable that the emo kids of the 2000s would age out of it. Some people will say it's because the bands are too corny or got too commercial and oversaturated the genre, and I suppose there's some truth to that, but overall, I don't think that's the case. I think it's as simple as you can't stay an emo kid forever. At least not on the outside, but you can still be that emo kid inside, as you'll see if you ever go to Emo Nite or you ever see a band cover Fall Out Boy or My Chemical Romance at a show. You will see a whole lot of people who are normal 28-year-olds with office jobs on the outside, but inside they are still that emo kid losing their shit and singing along like it's 2005 again. And so in some sense, you could say that emo is still alive, which brings us to the next section.
Girls wear huge buckles on their waists, double piercings in their lips,
snake bites,
and band rags in their pockets.
Emo's not dead. Or what is the legacy of emo? You do have your nostalgia plays like Emo Nite or the 20th anniversary tours and stuff that do well, but there's more to it than just that. There's actually a very active underground real emo scene with bands like Front Bottoms and Mom Jeans.
Tambourine, or when I sing, you sing harmonies. I wanna contribute.
Personally, that stuff's not really my thing because it kind of goes a little bit more towards the indie side of things, and like I said, I don't like indie music. But I do think it's very well done, and the people in that scene are super passionate about it, so I can respect that. There's also the super underground real screamo or scrams bands. Definitely not my thing musically or aesthetically, because I saw a lot of the OG bands play in some basement and fall down on the floor crying in 1994, so to see other people do that now is not that interesting to me, but I get it. They do it well. But you know what's coming next. If you've watched my other videos, you know that I couldn't do this video without talking about emo rap, because it really is just a reincarnation of the 2000s emo scene with a new spin on it. And if you're not familiar, I'm talking about stuff that sounds like this. The big name here, of course, is Lil Peep. And I really truly think that he was on the verge of bringing emo back to the mainstream, and it's incredibly sad that we lost him so young. I would also say the same thing about Juice WRLD, who we also sadly lost in 2019. And maybe to a lesser extent, XXXTENTACION. I think a lot of people aren't aware of how much emo rap stuff he actually did. And unfortunately, he also died just as he was blowing up. There's also tons of smaller artists in the genre that I absolutely love, like Lil Lotus,
Losing all control, don't let me down, just let me know.
Convoke, Nothing Nowhere, Shinigami, guccihighwaters, among many, many others.
Sorry that I fucked up, now we go through it again, where I gain another pain and I lose another friend.
And by the way, if you like the sound of that and you want to hear more emo rap, I do have a Spotify playlist of it that I update pretty regularly. There's a link to that in the description if you want to check it out. But I really think we'll never know how big the genre could have been simply because we lost the three biggest stars before they really ever hit their prime. Rest in peace to all three of them, as well as Hella Sketchy and everybody else that we lost. But to me, maybe the most meaningful impact that emo had is on our larger awareness of mental health and addiction. And what I mean is that in addition to the songs and the stars and all the other stuff I talked about, the other reason that emo became such a phenomenon is that it tapped into some very specific emotions. On the more benign side of things, it was that very like teenage suburban angst of like, oh, I don't fit in, nobody likes me, I don't have any friends at school, so I'm gonna wear purple stripy gloves every day. which is kind of cute and funny and easy to laugh at in hindsight, but there was also a much darker side of it.
Sometimes life gets fucked up, that's why we get fucked up.
The very real kind of like clinical depression and anxiety that fortunately is a lot more commonly discussed and understood now, but even as recently as the 2000s was like not discussed or talked about really at all. Nobody went to therapy. If you were on antidepressants or something, that meant you were crazy. Our thinking has evolved tremendously since then, and I think that emo honestly deserves some of the credit for that. Because when we saw kids acting emo, we used to just kind of laugh it off as that like melodramatic suburban teenage angst, which oftentimes it was. But thanks to the emo bands and people like Lil Peep, I think now we know that it's not always that simple. That sometimes we're looking at somebody who is in real pain, real trouble, and needs help. Somebody that is very much not okay. Peep is the perfect example of that. In hindsight, everybody looks back and says, wow, we should have seen that coming. And I think we learned from that. So as much fun as it is to look back at emo and kind of laugh at the goofy haircuts and stuff like that, I think we should also acknowledge that it made a real difference in the lives of a lot of people and made a real impact on how we think about mental health and addiction, and honestly, probably saved a lot of lives.
Fuck you, emos, and I'm sick of your goddamn shit.
All right, my friends, that does it for this video on the 2000s emo scene. As always, I would love to know what you think in the comments. Did you have an emo phase? Do you believe you were entitled to financial compensation? Let me know what you think in the comments. Before I let you go, two things really quickly. First of all, I have some new merch, like this pop punk shirt and this neon cartoon monster shirt. You can buy both of those at the link in the description. And also, I want to thank everybody who supports us on Patreon, especially those of you who support at the True Cult level or above. Patrons get every one of my podcasts a week early. There's a members-only Discord server that I'm in all the time. I started doing patron-only Q&As. There's a way to have me review your music or video or artwork or anything else you would like to get my eyes on. So if you would like to support us on Patreon, you can do that at the link in the description. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but I will see you next time.